The maternity ward at City General Hospital was always filled with the joyful sounds of new life and happy families. But on this particular autumn morning, something felt different. Nurse Rose, a dedicated healthcare worker with deep brown eyes that sparkled with warmth, had just started her morning rounds. After 15 years in the maternity ward, she had developed what her colleagues called a sixth sense for spotting trouble. As she walked down the softly lit corridor, checking her patient charts, she couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach since her shift began. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, casting gentle shadows across the hospital floor, but even the cheerful morning light couldn't brighten her mood. Room 302 was her next stop. Inside, a new mother had given birth just hours earlier to a beautiful baby girl. Most new mothers she encountered were either sleeping peacefully or cooing over their newborns, their faces glowing despite their exhaustion. But when Nurse Rose entered the room, the atmosphere felt heavy, like a thick cloud hanging in the air. The new mother was sitting up in bed, cradling her sleeping infant. While other mothers typically bombarded nurses with questions about feeding schedules and diaper changes, this one barely looked up when Rose entered. Her shoulders were hunched, and she seemed to be trying to make herself as small as possible in the large hospital bed. "Good morning," Nurse Rose said softly, keeping her voice warm and gentle. "How are you feeling today?" She approached the bed slowly, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. Something about the way the young mother held herself made Rose's professional instincts kick into high gear. As she began her routine checkup, she noticed the mother's arms. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. New mothers often had marks from IVs and blood draws. But as Rose gently helped her adjust her position to check her vital signs, she spotted something that made her heart skip a beat. There were bruises, but not the kind that came from medical procedures. These were different, older, darker, and in places where no hospital staff would have reason to touch. The mother, seeming to notice Rose's careful observation, quickly pulled her hospital gown sleeve down. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that fleeting second, Rose saw something that broke her heart, fear, raw and unmistakable, swimming in the depths of those tired eyes. Years of experience had taught Rose that timing was everything in situations like this. She couldn't rush in with questions or assumptions. Instead, she continued her checkup with practiced care, making sure to keep her movements predictable and gentle. She talked softly about the baby, about the weather, about simple things that might help put the new mother at ease. "Your little one has such beautiful eyes," Rose commented, hoping to create a connection. The baby had indeed woken up and was looking around with that unfocused newborn gaze that all nurses found so endearing. For the first time since Rose entered the room, she saw a genuine smile flicker across the mother's face. As Rose made notes in her chart, she heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. The change in the room was instant and palpable. The mother's body tensed, her arms tightening ever so slightly around her baby. The smile vanished, replaced by an expression that Rose had seen too many times before in her career, the look of someone bracing themselves. Standing by the bed, Rose felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. In all her years of nursing, she had learned that sometimes the most important part of her job wasn't changing bandages or administering medication. Sometimes it was being observant enough to notice when something wasn't right and brave enough to do something about it. As she finished her initial assessment, Rose knew that her morning was about to become much more complicated than a routine set of rounds. But she also knew that she wouldn't walk away. Not when her instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong. Not when there were two lives that might need more than just medical care to heal. With one last gentle smile at the mother and child, Rose left the room, her mind already forming a plan. She had protocols to follow, people to alert, and most importantly, a vulnerable patient and newborn to protect. This was why she had become a nurse, not just to heal physical wounds, but to be there when people needed an advocate, a protector, someone who would notice and care enough to act. After her initial observations, Nurse Rose knew she needed to conduct a more thorough assessment. She gathered her supplies on a small cart, taking her time to organize everything perfectly. Each movement was deliberate as she prepared herself mentally for what might be a challenging conversation. When she returned to room 302, the new mother was attempting to feed her baby. Rose noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she tried to position the infant. Most new mothers struggled with feeding at first, but this seemed different. There was a nervousness that went beyond typical new parent anxiety. "Would you like some help getting comfortable?" Rose asked, keeping her voice soft and reassuring. The mother nodded almost imperceptibly, and Rose stepped forward, demonstrating proper positioning with a small pillow. As she helped adjust the baby, she couldn't help but notice more concerning marks peeking out from under the hospital gown. The bruises told the story, one that made Rose's heart ache. Some were fresh, while others had faded to different shades, suggesting they'd happened over time. As a medical professional, she knew the difference between accidental marks and those caused by something more sinister. These weren't from bumping into furniture or pregnancy-related clumsiness. Rose maintained casual conversation while she worked, talking about the weather and sharing simple tips about baby care. She noticed how the mother's eyes constantly darted to the door, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. Even the smallest sounds from the hallway made her flinch. "The little one has such a strong grip," Rose commented warmly as the baby wrapped tiny fingers around her thumb. For a brief moment, the mother's face softened, and she actually made eye contact with Rose. In that instant, Rose saw a glimpse of who this young woman might be when she wasn't afraid. Someone with a gentle spirit and a beautiful smile. The moment was shattered by heavy footsteps in the hallway. The mother's husband entered the room, and the atmosphere changed instantly. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and the mother's body language transformed completely. She drew into herself, making her presence as small as possible. "How's everything going in here?" he asked, his voice carrying a false cheerfulness that didn't match his rigid posture. He moved to stand next to the bed, and Rose noticed how he positioned himself between her and his wife, like a barrier. "Just helping with the first feeding," Rose replied professionally, keeping her voice steady and calm. She watched as he took control of the conversation, answering questions she directed at his wife, checking the monitors as if searching for something wrong. When Rose mentioned doing a standard physical examination, the husband insisted on staying. This wasn't unusual. Many partners wanted to be present for everything. But something about his insistence felt wrong. It wasn't the protective concern of a new father, it was something more controlling. "Hospital policy requires private examinations," Rose stated firmly, using a tone that left no room for argument. She had learned over the years that sometimes you had to be strong to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The husband's jaw clenched, but he couldn't argue with hospital policy. As he left the room, Rose noticed the mother's vital signs on the monitor. Her heart rate, which had been elevated, began to slowly decrease. During the examination, Rose was gentle but thorough. She documented everything she saw, making detailed notes that might be important later. When she helped the mother change positions, she noticed how she moved with careful, practiced movements, like someone used to being in pain. "You're doing a wonderful job with the baby," Rose said softly, trying to build trust. "Being a new mom isn't easy, but you're not alone. We're here to help, with everything." She emphasized the last word slightly, hoping the mother would understand its deeper meaning. For a moment, something flickered in the mother's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or a tiny spark of hope. But she quickly looked away, focusing intently on her sleeping baby. Rose recognized this too, the way abuse survivors often found strength in protecting others, even when they couldn't protect themselves. As Rose finished her examination, she knew she needed to act carefully but quickly. The signs were all there, the physical marks, the behavioral changes, the controlling presence of the husband. But she also knew that the next steps would be crucial. One wrong move could make the situation worse. She left the room with a promise to return soon, her mind already working through the hospital's domestic violence protocols. Years of experience had taught her that these situations required a delicate balance of urgency and patience. The mother and baby's safety would depend on handling this exactly right. The afternoon shift was getting busier in the maternity ward, but Nurse Rose couldn't stop thinking about room 302. As she made her regular rounds, she kept noticing more red flags that made her increasingly concerned about the new mother and her baby's safety. Every time Rose passed by the room, she observed how the husband maintained his controlling presence. He sat in the chair closest to the door, as if guarding it. When other nurses came in to check vitals or bring food, he would immediately stand up, hovering over every interaction. His behavior reminded Rose of a puppet master pulling invisible strings that controlled every movement in the room. During one visit, Rose noticed how he kept answering questions meant for his wife. When the lactation consultant asked about feeding schedules, he jumped in before his wife could speak. "She's doing fine with it. We don't need any help." The consultant looked surprised, as most new parents usually had dozens of questions. The mother's phone was another telling detail. Rose noticed how it always sat on the husband's side table, just out of his wife's reach. Whenever it buzzed with a message, he would check it first, deciding whether to show it to her. Just filtering out stress, he'd said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, "She needs to focus on the baby." Around mid-afternoon, Rose brought in some paperwork that needed filling out. Standard hospital forms for new parents. As she handed over the clipboard, she watched the husband grab it immediately. "I'll help you with this," he said to his wife, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Rose noticed how the mother's hands remained folded in her lap, like a child who'd been told not to touch anything. "Actually," Rose said firmly, "we need the mother's signature on these forms." "Hospital policy." She kept her voice professional but unwavering. The husband's face tightened for a moment, a flash of anger quickly masked by a forced smile. Just then, his phone rang. After checking the caller ID, he seemed agitated. "I have to take this," he said, stepping out of the room for the first time in hours. Rose noticed how the mother's shoulders instantly relaxed, like a heavy weight had been lifted. Taking advantage of this moment, Rose moved closer to the bed. "The baby's doing beautifully," she said softly, checking the infant's vital signs. "You must be so proud." The mother nodded, finally looking up with eyes that seemed more alert now that her husband was gone. Rose continued her routine checks, maintaining casual conversation. She talked about simple things: the weather, the hospital's visiting hours, the support services available for new mothers. She emphasized words like help and support carefully, watching for any reaction. When she mentioned the hospital's social worker, who specialized in helping new mothers adjust to parenthood, she saw something flicker in the mother's eyes. It was brief, but it was there. A glimpse of recognition, perhaps even hope. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. The mother's vitals instantly changed on the monitor, her heart rate spiking, her blood pressure rising. Rose had been watching these patterns all day, noting how the numbers told their own story of fear and stress. The husband returned, still on his phone, but watching every move in the room like a hawk. Rose noticed how he positioned himself between the bed and the door again, his presence filling the small space with unspoken tension. As Rose prepared to leave, she deliberately dropped her pen near the mother's bed. As she bent to retrieve it, she whispered very softly, "If you need help, squeeze my hand twice." She pretended to steady herself on the bed rail, her hand close to the mother's. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, so subtle it was barely noticeable, she felt two distinct squeezes. The mother's face remained unchanged, her eyes focused on her baby, but her fingers had spoken volumes. Walking out of the room, Rose felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders grow heavier. She had confirmed what her instincts had been telling her all along. Now she needed to act, but carefully. One wrong move could make the situation worse. She headed straight to the nurse's station, her mind already forming a plan. Years of experience had taught her that timing was crucial in these situations. She needed to coordinate with hospital security, contact the social worker, and most importantly, ensure that both mother and baby remained safe. As she reached for the phone at the nurse's station, Rose caught a glimpse of herself in the window's reflection. The determined look in her eyes reminded her of why she became a nurse in the first place, not just to heal physical wounds, but to be a voice for those who had been silenced. Today, that purpose felt more important than ever. The opportunity Nurse Rose had been waiting for finally came during the evening shift change. The husband had reluctantly left to get dinner from the hospital cafeteria after much convincing from Rose that his wife needed to rest. As soon as he was gone, Rose quietly entered room 302, closing the door behind her. The mother was gently rocking her baby, humming a soft lullaby. In this rare moment without her husband's presence, she looked almost peaceful. but Rose could still see the underlying tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing at the door. "Little one's getting sleepy," Rose said softly, approaching the bed. She noticed how the mother's hands trembled slightly less when she was alone. "We have a nursery where the baby can rest while you get some sleep too." She kept her voice gentle, non-threatening. The mother looked up, meeting Rose's eyes for the first time all day. There was something different in her gaze now, a tiny spark of trust beginning to form. Rose took this as her cue to continue. "I want to share something with you," Rose said, pulling up a chair. "A few years ago, I had a patient, a young mother just like you. She was scared, hurt, and felt so alone." Rose watched as the mother's fingers tightened slightly around her baby's blanket. "This mother thought she had no choices," Rose continued carefully. "She believed she had to stay silent to protect her baby. But she discovered something important. Staying in a dangerous situation wasn't protecting anyone." Rose paused, letting her words sink in. The mother's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "I don't know what you're talking about." But her trembling hands told a different story. Rose reached out slowly, placing her hand near the mother's on the bed rail, not touching, just offering support. "When I see someone hurting, it's my job to help. Not just as a nurse, but as a human being. You don't have to tell me anything, but I want you to know you're not alone." Something in those words seemed to break through the wall the mother had built around herself. A tear rolled down her cheek as she looked down at her sleeping baby. "I thought things would get better when I got pregnant," she whispered. "He promised they would." Rose listened quietly as the mother's story began to pour out, like a dam finally breaking. She spoke of a relationship that had started with such hope, of small controlling behaviors that grew into something more frightening. The pregnancy had made everything worse, not better. "I'm so scared," the mother admitted, her voice cracking. "Not just for me anymore. When I look at her," she gently touched her baby's cheek. "I don't want her to grow up thinking this is normal, but I don't know how to leave. He says no one will help me, that they'll take my baby away." Rose felt her heart breaking for this young mother, but she kept her voice steady and professional. "Those are lies meant to keep you trapped. There are people whose entire job is to help mothers and babies in situations like this. You have rights and you have options." The mother looked up sharply at the sound of distant footsteps in the hallway, fear instantly returning to her eyes. But the footsteps passed by, and Rose saw her slowly exhale. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Rose assured her. "But I want you to know that when you're ready, we have resources. We can connect you with people who can help you make a safe plan. For both of you." She gestured to the sleeping baby. The mother was quiet for a long moment, gently stroking her baby's hand. When she spoke again, her voice was different, still quiet, but with a hint of something new. Determination, maybe, or hope. "He checks my phone," she said. "He monitors everything. He even has cameras at home." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But he can't control everything here in the hospital, can he?" Rose shook her head slowly. "No, he can't. The hospital has policies and security measures in place. Your safety and your baby's safety are our top priority." She reached for a small notepad in her pocket. "Would you like to know what those resources are?" The mother nodded, and for the first time that day, she sat up straighter in her bed. It was a small change, but to Rose, it felt like watching someone take their first step toward freedom. The sound of the elevator down the hall made them both tense. He would be back soon. But in those few precious minutes, Rose had witnessed something powerful, the moment when fear began to give way to courage, when isolation started to crack under the weight of support and understanding. As Rose quickly wrote down some information, she knew this was just the beginning. The hardest part was still to come, but at least now this mother knew she wasn't alone in her fight. After her conversation with the mother, Nurse Rose didn't waste any time. She knew they had a small window of opportunity, and every minute counted. Walking briskly to the nurse's station, she caught the eye of her supervisor and gave a subtle nod, their prearranged signal that they needed to talk privately. In the small office away from prying eyes, Rose quickly shared what she had learned. Her supervisor listened intently, occasionally making notes. They both knew the next steps had to be handled perfectly. One wrong move could put both mother and baby at risk. "I've already contacted the hospital's social worker," Rose explained, her voice steady but urgent. "She's on her way in. We need to document everything properly, but we also need to move quickly." She pulled out her detailed notes from the day's observations, each incident carefully recorded with times and dates. The supervisor picked up the phone, calling hospital security to alert them of the situation. They needed extra eyes on room 302, but it had to be subtle. Any obvious security presence might spook the husband and make things worse. Meanwhile, Rose gathered the necessary paperwork. Her hands moved quickly but carefully as she filled out incident reports and domestic violence documentation. Years of experience had taught her exactly what information would be crucial later, both for the mother's protection and for any legal proceedings that might follow. Just then, the social worker arrived. She was a calm, seasoned professional who had handled many similar cases. The three women quickly formed a plan. They would need to coordinate with local domestic violence organizations, arrange for safe housing, and most importantly, ensure the mother and baby could leave the hospital safely when the time came. "We'll need to do this under the guise of routine medical procedures," the social worker suggested. "It's the safest way to separate them temporarily." Rose nodded in agreement. They often used this approach. Standard medical protocols that required patients to be alone could create safe spaces for intervention. As they finished their planning, a call came from the maternity ward. The husband had returned from the cafeteria and was asking questions about why his wife needed so many checkups. Rose knew she needed to get back there quickly. Returning to room 302, she found the atmosphere tense. The husband was standing by the window, his posture rigid with barely contained anger. "Why does she keep needing examinations?" he demanded as soon as Rose entered. "She just had a baby. She needs rest." Rose maintained her professional demeanor, her voice calm and steady. "Standard post-delivery protocol requires regular monitoring of both mother and baby," she explained. "We need to ensure there are no complications." She moved to check the baby's vital signs, her movements deliberate and confident. The husband watched her every move, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "I want to speak to your supervisor," he stated, his tone growing more aggressive. "This doesn't seem right." "Of course," Rose replied smoothly. "I'll have them come by shortly." She continued her work, noticing how the mother had gone completely silent again, her eyes fixed on her sleeping baby. As Rose finished her checks, she saw hospital security walk past the room, casual but alert, just as planned. The pieces were falling into place. Now they just needed the right moment to act. That moment came sooner than expected. The husband's phone rang again. Another important business call he couldn't ignore. As he stepped into the hallway, Rose quickly pressed the call button she'd hidden under the mother's pillow earlier. Within moments, the social worker appeared with a wheelchair. "We need to take the baby for some routine tests," she announced professionally. "And we'll need to do a quick checkup on mom as well. Hospital policy requires these to be done separately." The husband, still on his phone, began to protest, but Rose was already helping the mother into the wheelchair. "It's standard procedure," she repeated firmly. "We'll have them both back shortly." As they wheeled mother and baby down the hallway, Rose could see the husband's reflection in the window, his face darkening with anger as he ended his call. She knew they had limited time before he realized something was wrong. They turned the corner, heading not toward the examination room, but to a secure area of the hospital where security was waiting. The mother's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she whispered, "Thank you." Rose squeezed her shoulder gently as they continued moving. There would be challenges ahead, but for now, they had achieved the most important goal, creating a safe space where this mother could begin to reclaim her life and her baby could have a chance at a peaceful future. Everything happened quickly once they reached the secure area of the hospital. 2 police officers were already waiting, having responded to what was officially called a medical emergency. They kept their presence low-key, dressed in plain clothes to avoid drawing attention. Years of handling similar situations had taught them the importance of discretion. Nurse Rose stayed close to the mother as she gave her statement to the officers. The young woman's voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. She described years of control and fear, of watching her freedom slip away bit by bit. The baby slept peacefully in her arms, unaware of the momentous changes happening around her. "Take your time," one of the officers said gently, her notebook ready. "Every detail helps." The mother nodded, continuing her story. She described how things had gotten worse during her pregnancy, how the control had become more intense. Rose noticed how the mother's hands steadied as she spoke, as if each word was lifting a weight from her shoulders. Suddenly, they heard commotion from the hallway. The husband had realized something was wrong and was demanding to know where his wife was. His voice echoed down the corridor, growing louder and more aggressive with each passing moment. "You can't keep me from my wife," his voice boomed. "I have rights." The sound made the mother flinch, but she didn't stop talking. If anything, his outburst seemed to strengthen her resolve. Hospital security had already moved to intercept him, keeping him away from the secure area. Rose could hear them calmly explaining hospital policies, their trained voices steady and professional. But the husband's anger only escalated. "I'll call my lawyer," he threatened, his voice carrying even through the closed doors. "You can't do this," but his threats had no power here. The hospital staff had followed every protocol perfectly, ensuring everything was done by the book. The social worker arrived with paperwork for an emergency restraining order. She explained each document carefully to the mother, making sure she understood her rights and options. "You're doing the right thing," she assured her, "both for yourself and your baby." As they worked through the paperwork, Rose noticed a subtle change in the mother's demeanor. Her shoulders straightened slightly, her chin lifted. It was as if each signature was an act of reclaiming her life, one page at a time. The baby began to stir, making little fussy sounds. The mother responded instantly, her movements gentle and natural as she soothed her child. Rose watched the interaction with a warm smile. This was the most relaxed she'd seen the mother all day. Outside, they could still hear the husband's protests, but they were growing more distant as security escorted him from the building. The officers exchanged glances. They'd seen this pattern before. Men like him often showed their true colors when they felt their control slipping away. "We've contacted the women's shelter," the social worker explained quietly. "They have a secure room ready for you and the baby. There will be support staff available around the clock." The mother nodded, tears filling her eyes, but these were different tears from before. They looked more like relief than fear. Rose helped gather the few belongings they had brought to the hospital, carefully packing them in a plain bag provided by the shelter. Each item was checked to ensure there were no hidden tracking devices, another set necessity they'd learned from experience. "What happens now?" the mother asked softly, looking down at her sleeping baby. Her voice was steady despite the enormity of the moment. The social worker explained the next steps, the shelter's security measures, the support services available, the legal help they could provide. "You're not alone anymore," she assured her. "We'll help you build a new life, one step at a time." Rose watched as the mother absorbed this information, noting how different she looked from the frightened woman she'd first met that morning. There was still fear in her eyes, but now it was mixed with something else. Hope, maybe even the beginning of strength. As they prepared for the transfer to the shelter, Rose felt a familiar mix of emotions. She'd been through this process many times before, but each case touched her heart in a different way. This was why she'd become a nurse, not just to heal physical wounds, but to help people find their way to safety and healing. The mother reached out and grabbed Rose's hand as they waited for the shelter's transport team. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think anyone would notice or care." Rose squeezed her hand gently. "There are always people who notice," she replied softly. "And there are always people who care." The baby made a small cooing sound, as if agreeing with her words. 3 months had passed since that life-changing day in the maternity ward. Nurse Rose sat at her desk, reviewing patient charts during a quiet moment in her shift. A familiar envelope caught her eye. It had arrived that morning from the local women's shelter. Opening it carefully, she found a handwritten note and a small photograph. The photo showed a baby girl, now 3 months old, wearing a tiny pink dress and sporting a beautiful smile. The transformation in the image brought tears to Rose's eyes, not just in the baby, but in the mother as well. The woman in the photo was almost unrecognizable from the frightened patient Rose had met that day. Her smile reached her eyes now, and she held herself with a confidence that spoke of healing and hope. The bruises were gone, but more importantly, so was the fear that had haunted her face. The note told a story of small victories and daily progress. The mother had found a job, working part-time while taking online classes. The shelter had helped her secure safe housing in a different city, where she was slowly building a new life for herself and her daughter. "Some days are still hard," the note read, "but now I know I'm strong enough to face them. My daughter will grow up seeing her mother stand tall, not cower in fear. You helped me give her that gift." Rose carefully tucked the photo and note into her personal folder, where she kept similar reminders of why she did this work. Each story represented not just an intervention, but a complete change in life trajectory for both mother and child. Later that day, during her rounds, Rose passed by room 302. It had seen many patients since that day, but she never walked by without remembering. The memory served as a reminder to always trust her instincts, to look beyond the surface of what patients showed her. At the nurse's station, a new nurse was struggling with a difficult situation, a patient who seemed withdrawn, showing signs that concerned her. Rose watched as the young nurse hesitated, unsure whether to act on her suspicions. "Trust your gut," Rose told her quietly, sharing the wisdom of her years of experience. Sometimes the most important part of nursing isn't the medical procedures, it's being willing to see what others might miss and brave enough to act on it. The new nurse nodded, her expression determined as she reached for the hospital's resource folder. Rose smiled, remembering her own early days and how each case had helped build her confidence in handling difficult situations. During her lunch break, Rose attended a hospital staff meeting where they discussed updating their domestic violence protocols. She shared her experiences, helping shape policies that would make it easier for future nurses to help patients in similar situations. "The key is creating safe spaces," she explained to her colleagues. "Sometimes all a person needs is one moment where they feel secure enough to ask for help. One person who notices, who shows them they're not alone." As her shift neared its end, Rose received another update, this time from the hospital's social worker. The mother had testified in court, helping secure a permanent restraining order. Her story had inspired 2 other women at the shelter to take similar steps toward freedom. Walking to her car that evening, Rose thought about the ripple effects of that one day, that one decision to trust her instincts. One intervention had not only saved 2 lives, but had created waves of positive change that continued to spread. The setting sun painted the hospital windows in warm colors as Rose gathered her belongings. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, and perhaps new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, she carried with her the knowledge that somewhere, a mother and her baby were safe, healing, and building a new life, all because someone had taken the time to notice and care. As she drove home, Rose reflected on how every small action could lead to profound changes. Sometimes it just took one person willing to see, to speak up, to stand firm. In her 15 years of nursing, she had learned that healing came in many forms, and sometimes the most important medicine was simply showing someone they weren't alone. The photo from the shelter would join others in her collection, not trophies, but reminders of why she chose this profession. Each image told a story of transformation, of lives redirected toward hope and healing. These were the moments that made all the difficult days worthwhile. Back home, Rose added a small note to her journal, as she did each night. "Remember room 302, she wrote. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest observations. Keep your eyes open, your heart ready, and never be afraid to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves."